That we'll let the expert actually talk about what all this entails. So please welcome Jeff Scheaffer. Okay, sir. Good luck.
Good morning, Roger. Good morning, everybody. And I am thrilled to be here today and thank all of you for your time and your participation in the DevOps and Cloud Expo. My name is Jeff Scheaffer. I am the general manager for CA's Continuous Delivery Business Unit. And the Continuous Delivery Business Unit exists as part of these DevOps transformational projects. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about and share with you some of the things that we're learning, not only as we serve the market, but also, some of our internal experiences as well. So starting this, always useful to talk a little bit about, kind of some framing thoughts for the rest of the discussion. And one of the key thoughts from the CEO of Netflix, Reed Hastings, is the idea that very rarely do companies die from moving too fast, but very frequently they die from moving too slowly. And I thought that's a good framing concept as we talk about what it is that we're trying to achieve when we think about DevOps and the age of cloud craftsmanship. So with that, let's start with a little bit of a discussion. So it is an exciting time for all of us to be in the technology industry. And one of the reasons for that is that with digital disruption and the fact that everything becomes this application-driven economy, the applications, web and mobile, become the primary method by which every company interacts and promotes their brand, their products, and their services to their end consumers. And their ability to compete in the market depends on their ability to deliver those applications, as you all know, and to provide that amazing value, great user experience, but to do it quickly with quality. And by the way, like any other factor of production in a company, it's got to be done cost effectively. And we'll come back to that in a minute. And so as every company is following this journey, born digital, transforming digital, they're becoming a software business. And one of the things that we know is that all software is in a direction, in the long arc direction, to the cloud. And so when we look at, for example, the Wikibon research around private and public cloud adoption, what we can see over time is kind of a very significant change. And when you talk to the companies and read through the research, the kind of dark blue at the bottom is the reduction in terms of IT spend for on-premise infrastructure. The pink and the blue is the increasing spend around private cloud infrastructure or public cloud infrastructure, and then the light gray on top is actually the overall reduction in spend in IT operational staff, as a lot of that work is being out-tasked as people adopt cloud or there's a lower cost of adoption. Now, one of the things we know in the research overall is like with 95% of the companies are using public and private clouds today, 85% have a multi-cloud strategy, whether that be multiple public clouds or a public-private cloud mix. At the very bottom, those companies are on average using 8 different clouds. So considering this is the Cloud Expo, I want to talk a little bit around cloud adoption, and I know that everyone in here has been focused on that overall. But while the software is moving to the cloud, as we talked a minute ago, the fundamentals in terms of software and the application economy are the same. It's about the user experience. It's about velocity. And one of the things that I wanted to take a moment to talk about with respect to velocity is one of the deep misconceptions I often hear in terms of what does it mean to do DevOps and DevOps with the cloud. A lot of times people articulate it simply as it's about getting software into production faster. That's a byproduct. The real objective of DevOps and cloud, the real objective of velocity, is to keep pace with the competitive rate of change companies are facing in their markets. I want to take just a moment to let that one sink in. And one of the ways that we traditionally measure velocity around projects today, and we'll talk about this a little later, is this idea of from the build to the production environment, can we measure the time? That is a component metric, but the real value is if we can measure from ideation to the time it's actually released into a production environment and delivering value to one of the end consumers. That's the real measure of velocity when we think about DevOps in the age of cloud craftsmanship. This next thing I want to talk about is it's about quality. And we'll talk later about quality because this turns out to continue to be kind of a challenge or the Achilles heel in the overall DevOps initiatives, and then also while driving costs lower. So if you need to go faster, higher quality, and lower cost of delivery. There's a very interesting kind of problem there is companies today spend roughly $60 billion a year to test, deliver, and release custom web and mobile applications. It's about $57 billion in labor, services, and test environments, and it's about $3 billion in tools. And that's a fairly significant cost burden around the DevOps and the cloud architectures. And so when you start adopting DevOps tool chains, it starts to address this cost factor as well. All right, so that then brings us to this kind of thinking, which is if I have to go with great experience, good value, go faster, higher quality, lower cost, that starts to bring kind of a transformational moment in the industry. And that's ushering in the age of this idea of DevOps and the age of cloud craftsmanship. Now, one of the things that I find interesting about that is it's a number of things that have to hang together to be successful. One of them is the changing application architectures, and we're all familiar with that. There's new application development languages. There's new, applications are being componentized into a collection of APIs in the app economy. Oftentimes the API is the app. Microservices, they're loosely coupled frameworks. They're containerized. They're cloud-based, cloud native. Lots of things going on in terms of application architecture changes. There's the whole shift in terms of the DevOps and a modern software factory, and the rest of the presentation will go into that detail. And finally, a discussion around security and how it has to be pervasive overall, which is really about how do you secure all of the attack surfaces or harden the attack surfaces of the infrastructure, the applications, and then do defense in depth. Now, broadly in the conference, there will be a number of conference discussions around architectures and security. So I'm going to focus our discussion in terms of this modern software factory and how DevOps and the cloud are intersecting each other and go a little more deep around that. So when we talk about DevOps, and this was the discussion Roger and I were having earlier, one of the things we find with DevOps that's really interesting in the market today, everybody's talking about DevOps. If we look and track search volume on the DevOps keyword with something like Google, we can see that there is roughly an order of 10 magnitude in change in the number of searches that are being conducted on the word DevOps. And we know that when we survey, and this was done with the Freedom Dynamics survey customers, 80% or people across the industry, 87% say they've implemented DevOps in their organization. 45% increase in the number of posted positions with DevOps, and there's something like 49% of all positions on LinkedIn now include the word DevOps as part of their job descriptions or their titles. I don't actually believe that we're being that, and very few are practicing DevOps, because when you get to the next level of detail, only 22% actually have DevOps teams. It's a very interesting discussion. So how do you reconcile that? I can tell you, at least from my perspective, when I've talked with any number of colleagues and companies that are really focused on this across the industry, large financial institutions, for example, can have several thousand application projects. That's not applications, but projects running at the same time. And you'll ask them, what percentage of them are doing things like Agile DevOps, continuous delivery, those types of capabilities? And what you'll find is they'll say, yeah, about 10% are Agile, 90% are kind of traditional methods, and of the 10% that are Agile, only 2 or 3, you're like 2 or 3%? No, 2 or 3 projects that are actually trying to implement the end-to-end DevOps paradigm. And that's kind of one of the challenges, is that everyone's kind of getting DevOps dipped, and there's a subset of people that are actually doing it, but the vast majority of projects have not actually started this journey yet. So it's an exciting time for all of us in the room, because we're early in this transformational journey, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the benefits of bringing DevOps and the cloud together, and the economic advantage and the drivers that companies and across the industry can realize. So while we talked that very few companies are actually doing DevOps and have DevOps teams, also in the research, and this is with Freedom Dynamics, and this research was over 1,000 professionals, so a statistically significant sample across 9 different countries done by Freedom Dynamics, indicated only 1 in 5 are actually using DevOps in the cloud. And the survey results come back in kind of an interesting thing, and let's dive into this. So if you look at the whole population, the thing that really stood out to me is that 48% of the population, when really asked and interviewed, what are you really doing? They're still anchored for the majority of their work in traditional methods, right? It's waterfall-based application software lifecycle projects in traditional IT environments. They're really anchored that way, and they have only a few bright spots of innovation where they're actually doing something more advanced. Then there's about 37% that are the cloud, but only of that 17% of them are kind of your cloud champions. And these are the guys that have adopted the cloud, and the real use case is they use it as like a VM vending machine. It's just making infrastructure more readily available for every other purpose, but they really haven't transformed up from the infrastructure into an application focus. Then there's the DevOps devotees, where they're trying to adopt automation technologies and practices around DevOps in order to be faster with software, but only 1 in 5 actually combine both DevOps with the cloud, which is the nature of our conversation today. Now, if you look at that, cloud champions, they see benefits, right, around velocity. So how quickly can they get a project completed? They see significant improvements because they're eliminating a lot of the friction in terms of infrastructure availability, test environments. Predictability in terms of the availability of cloud resources. They see an improvement in quality, the UX and the customer experience, and finally, an improvement in cost control. I think it's worth noting that quality and UX lag the other 3 dimensions. By the same time, if you look at the DevOps practitioners, they also see an improvement in speed. Predictability, they drag way behind. Quality and UX from the prior slide are very similar, and a significant improvement in cost as they automate the practices. And when you combine the 2 together, and you look at DevOps with the cloud, 81% overall improvement, and that is a self-assessment by the population of respondents. And I know that someone will have a question about the underpinnings of the data. One comment I'd have on this particular data, what matters most is the directional vector and the relative magnitude between the types of personas, more than the precision of 81 versus 82% kind of discussion. If you really look into the data there and you compare DevOps to the cloud, the blue versus the yellow, one of the things that I find interesting is that DevOps leads in velocity and cost control. Again, it's an automation play. Cloud leads in the predictability, and when you bring them all together, you see substantial, an order of magnitude of improvement in overall performance across the software project. The thing that also stands out for me in there is quality lags way behind in terms of the level of improvement in the adoption of DevOps and the cloud, and we will come back, as I promised earlier, to that again. And so the question is, if there's so much benefit in DevOps in the cloud, and so few organizations have done it, why aren't companies adopting DevOps in the cloud more frequently? And so we've spent a lot of time looking into this topic, and the results of that research indicate it's because the people are stuck. They're truly stuck in their traditional software development life cycles and methodologies. DevOps requires that we go horizontal and that there's collaboration across silos. It changes with the culture and the practices and the tooling. But today, people are still stuck in the siloed methodologies, especially around the waterfall-based development processes. And if it's not the process itself, a lot of times inside of organizations, as the dev teams start to pivot towards agile continuous delivery and DevOps, we find that the governance models inside of companies, so how does an executive measure a return on investment, continues to enforce a committed bet methodology around a return on investment for any given investment in a software project, which forces people back into these, away from the agile methods and back more into these waterfall approaches. So when we look at that, what it really means to move forward in this idea around DevOps in the cloud is all about this idea of how do we adopt a modern software factory. And this is really an overall iterative journey, starting with Agile, moving over into continuous delivery, and then following up into an end-to-end DevOps across dev and operations. And what we want to talk about is a little bit about how that goes. So the first thing that we want to talk about is a software development team, they adopt Agile as a methodology. This is kind of one way to think about this is it's DevOps in a silo. It's DevOps within the dev team itself. And so it's very beneficial. We see that when we look at the ability to dynamically reassign resources, to be able to change and to be adaptive within the project itself and be able to focus on value, there's a 30 to 50% improvement over waterfall-based methods. One of the other key benefits, and this is some additional research that's not in the deck, but when people study whether any software project delivers a return on its business expectation, waterfall methods tend to be very low return rates, below 20% actually meet, less than 20% of all projects meet their business goals. When you adopt Agile methodology, it's somewhere around 80% of the projects actually meet the business goals. Not perfect, but a dramatic improvement in the number of business goals. Now, once you find, though, is you got dev up to velocity, but the rest of the value streams aren't at speed. And so the very next thing we start to do is we look at things like continuous delivery. So how do we do continuous builds and integration? How do we go into continuous deployment, continuous testing, continuous release? How do we approach continuous delivery in order to automate across the rest of the value streams? And that starts to bring the entire organization up to velocity. And we start to see dramatic improvements in terms of the reduction and compression of the cycle and the amount of cost and investment made in testing as we improve the automation or in terms of the deployment process. And then finally, we realize a full potential once we're able to expand beyond the development environment, test environment, and value streams into the end-to-end operations and start to create the feedback loops from operational data back into the development processes. Now, if this is the objective, the question is why aren't more people doing it? And it turns out it's not something you can buy, it's something you actually have to build. And when you look at how do you build or how do you make a successful transformation happen, there's some very keys to success. One of the key success factors is because it's driven by culture, it requires executive sponsorship and a tops-down driver because that's necessary to help work across the silos and bring it from a vertical silo orientation to a horizontal orientation. The second thing is the organizational practices. Almost always there's a bright spark of somebody who understands this. How do I go agile? How do I take continuous delivery? And how do I extend it to operations? And just that one engineer, that one team that really is able to kind of have that vision of how to instantiate that and bring it into an organization. And then the next question is how do you scale it? How do you expand that knowledge across an org? Automation across the entire software lifecycle, establishing feedback loops. We'll talk a little bit about that feedback loop later. Shift left, shift right. So how do I use artifacts reliably and repeatably across the process? Parallelization, key concept in terms of DevOps continuous delivery in the cloud. Most things in waterfall are very serialized. The code is built, goes over to test, it's tested, et cetera. In this particular instance, it's the ability to parallelize testing. It's the ability to parallelize feature branches with release branches, et cetera. And then kind of a modernized tool chain that's API driven, focused on automation, and moves away from manual tasks, and we'll talk more about that. So if that's the case, there's a lot of benefit. So we've talked about there's all this benefit in DevOps in the cloud, but one of the other interesting things is where's the real challenge? And so again, additional research says even in DevOps shops, the QA practice tends to be the stumbling block that precludes people from really achieving DevOps and continuous delivery in the cloud. And so over 63% of people find that, and they would focus there first. And so the question is, why is that? Well, first off, I'm curious, how many people are satisfied with the quality assurance and testing practices of their organization? The answer is almost nobody. And the reason is there's the goal of testing versus the reality of testing today. Test practices today are very heavily weighted towards manual user interface or GUI testing. Very little is happening in terms of automation. And there's a transformation going on, which is testing reality, which is to the goal of continuous testing, where the majority of the testing is automated at the unit testing, automated at the GUI functional testing and API testing, and there's less and less, there's still a role for like exploratory manual testing, but it's a smaller part. And part of that also is being able to do not just the functional and the but also the non-functional testing practices like performance and security, and left shift those earlier into the DevOps practice itself, which allows us to detect problems. I'll give you an example around the left shift. If you talk to companies like Facebook or LinkedIn, they're not able to do all of the non-functional testing at just UAT and into production. They actually start to left shift at the component testing phase, and the reason they do that is they're doing baseline compares. As the developer works on a component, they'll baseline performance test it, baseline security test it. Is it the same or stronger than the prior version of that component? Then it's probably, the inference is it'll work in production. If it's weaker, it's likely to cause a production degradation, and we need to address it early. And so there's a lot of things that are going on in terms of how that overall progresses. Now, one of the things that when we talk to all of across the industry is if QA is the bottleneck in DevOps, why is that? Most of the teams, even the ones that think they're DevOps, they still follow a traditional waterfall lifecycle. So if you look like this with dev versus, with planning to dev to test into release, that's a waterfall. And then if you look like this, which most companies in their journey towards DevOps in the cloud do, they start to break up the dev cycle into sprints. That starts to show, in this case, your kind of water scrum fall. And you do the development, then there's an over the wall to a testing phase, and then again to a release. From there, people start to look at, okay, how can I parallelize things, which is the first strong step. So if you're this particular state where dev is offset from testing practices, offset from the actual implementation and release practices, then you're not really agile, but you're definitely getting better with everything one sprint offset. And then finally, you finally get to this final current state in testing, and this is this continuous testing practice underneath the DevOps driver, which is where everything is being done in sprint, fully in sprint, automated tests, every single build, every single check-in, every pre-commit binary is fully technically validated across both the functional testing and all of the non-functional testing, for example, like performance and security components. And it's all done within sprint, which means every check-in's tested, there's no sprint lag effects, and every sprint becomes a viable release candidate that's technically validated. And one of the other interesting things in the whole journey towards DevOps and the cloud is this idea that we're separating the decision to release software is no longer just a technology decision, it becomes a business decision. So when you have an automated pipeline, you bring everything that's technically validated, it then becomes a business decision. It's like the two keys on the missile silo, so to speak. First key is the technical validation, business decision, do I release it to a production, or do I just continue on to the next sprint without changing the production release? So that's kind of one of the most key things about that. And it's a paradigm change that's starting to happen in organizations, but most organizations are not there yet. And this is what we talked earlier about, this end-to-end continuous testing concept around how do you shift left versus how do you shift right. And this is really the idea of reusing artifacts that are developed, like the testing artifacts that are developed in pre-production, and then taking them into production environments for validation in production. One of the other kind of key things in the whole idea of DevOps and the cloud is how do you do feedback loops? Kind of another key concept that starts to come in the overall testing practices. And an example of that is, how many people are, having to do, mobile applications versus, say, a traditional web application. And it turns out mobile applications are significantly harder to manage. And the reason for that is because when you look at the production environment, think about your own experience. No one updates their smartphones that frequently, or there's a good portion of the population that doesn't. Consequently, you end up with a long tail of versions that are actually in production usage. The second challenge with mobile applications is that they're on different operating systems, different versions of iOS, different versions of Android, different versions of Windows CE. They're on different hardware platforms, iPhones, Galaxies from Samsung, et cetera, and they're connected to different carriers. It becomes a factorial problem to be able to do continuous testing and validation of like a mobile application. So it's an M times N times O times P. And does anyone want to take a guess as to how many mobile carriers, telecom carriers there are worldwide? The answer is roughly 800 ILEC IDs. So you start to get the feel for the magnitude of that matrix. So one of the feedback loops is if you're doing operational monitoring of your mobile applications, you can determine which 5, 6, 10 N platform combinations represent 80% of your user base. And then you can left shift that insight back into your development and testing practices and be able to proactively test that subset of environments, be able to address and ensure quality of experience and user experience, and take your business risk in the tail. So it's a good example in my mind of this idea of shift left, shift right, and a good example of feedback loops in the overall continuous testing practices that become part of DevOps and DevOps to the cloud. One of the examples that I wanted to share with that is, I'm sure everyone's familiar with Best Buy. They're roughly a $40 billion company in terms of annual revenues, and in 2016, roughly 11% of their revenue actually is e-commerce and digital online revenue, which puts their revenues around $5 billion, 4.2, but $4.2 billion online. And how many people remember in 2014 when Best Buy on Black Friday had an online outage that took down their website and impacted not only their revenues but their stock prices, right? And so one of the challenges is how do you continuously deliver the software in that environment, respond to it and fix it and be able to test with it. And so that's one of the things where Best Buy is really pioneering a lot of the way in terms of what they're doing, in terms of how they are able to adopt DevOps, how they're able to provide cloud-based applications, and to be able to implement continuous testing to ensure the quality. Because indeed for them, transforming digital, an example of a transforming digital company, their business depends on it. And so they very much focused on this idea of the shift-left testing. They focus on how do they improve test efficiencies. For example, in this particular instance, the way they specifically achieve that efficiency is they reduce the cost of the test environments by virtualizing the test environments themselves with virtualization technologies. So it's a really good example of how companies are responding around public cloud applications or cloud-based applications with DevOps and in the cloud. All right, the second area where a lot of companies, so everyone's doing Agile. We talked about testing. QA still tends to be the bottleneck. If recalling the prior slide, roughly 21% of companies are struggling in the deployment process and 23% in the release process. And in combination, 44% of challenge or inefficiencies there is really around how do you orchestrate the entire software lifecycle and drive the continuous deployment and release processes. And so one of the challenges, of course, we know is that anything that's manual, driven by spreadsheets and dependent upon human labor and following instructions and kind of the tribal knowledge that's captured in the mind, it's prone to a lot of risk. There's a lot of delay. There's a lot of human latency in the process. Errors are made, so there's a lot of mistakes that get made, and operational bottlenecks. And so really there's a focus then in the market as a whole really on continuous deployment, continuous release processes that are under the continuous delivery umbrella, a part of DevOps. And part of that is the ability to provision out the test environments. Part of that's the ability to automatically deploy and execute and automate the testing, the automated test suites and the continuous testing suites. And then from there, moving in across each of the phases of the life cycle and into a production deployment. And examples of companies that have been very successful around and are making a lot of progress here is, for example, ING. For those of you who don't know ING is a financial services institution out of Europe. All financial institutions are really kind of an interesting challenge in the market today as things move to electronic banking, is what do they do with all their branch offices, right? So if you look at most financial institutions, and in the case of ING, they have 48 million subscribers across 40 different countries. But as people move to online banking or electronic banking, they're going into the branch offices less and less frequently. And most banks are systematically closing down the branch offices, which creates this cycle of increasing dependency on the electronic and online banking capabilities. Now, ING started this journey a number of years ago, and they had roughly 300 applications, several of them that were in consumer facing, and they have to be able to provide the latest capabilities and the latest services around their online and electronic banking infrastructure. So for example, e-check, or the ability to transfer, to get your tax documents, all of these capabilities. And they have to do that relative to competitors. And again, this comes back to the idea that the velocity is not so much about getting releases to production quickly, but it's about being able to keep pace with the competitive rate of change of your markets. So from 300 applications that were releasing once every 6 months to a year, they started adopting continuous deployment, continuous release capabilities in order to accelerate the velocity of those applications. Over about a 3-year period of time, they moved from 300 applications every 6 months to a year to where they're now those 300 applications are doing 30,000 deploys per month. And when you hear that, it's not all into production. A lot of those deploys are into the test environments. A lot of them into the pre-prod environments, and they never go live with the release. Some of them get promoted into a production stage. But they have a velocity in terms of how they're able to build the software in order to keep competitive pace of change in the market as a whole. And they continue to grow in terms of their presence and see significant improvement. So that's one of the things that I think is most interesting. The second thing that ING Bank is doing is they're starting to collect the analytics across the entire software lifecycle, pull back that analytics, and they're starting to analyze where do they have automated tasks, where do they have latency in their release processes waiting on manual tasks and approvals, and then systematically using that to drive improvement in the entire software lifecycle across the chain. So a very exciting set of capabilities there. And again, it's these public and private cloud-facing, public-facing applications. All right, final kind of part of the topic I wanted to share with this around DevOps and the cloud is we talked about, it's a journey from Agile, which is accelerating the dev practices. We talk about how continuous delivery brings up the rest of the value chains, and that's really about build, testing, the deployment, and the release functions. The final mile is how do we bring operations into the game? And that's really all about this idea of shift-left monitoring. And so how do we gain insight from production environments and bring that back into the development environments as a feedback loop and be more successful? And so one of the key things that we talked earlier is like, how do I do better mobile application testing by using real data out of the operational environment? There's other really good examples also. So for example, when applications are crashing in production environments and you want to be able to capture the stack traces and to be able to bring the stack trace and the crash analytics plus the environmental data back into dev, or you want to be able to systematically improve user experience, because when you think about, let's use mobile applications again, mobile application experience is predicated on concepts like, what are your stability? Do you crash on start? Do you crash on restarts? Do you crash on specific actions? How do I bring that data back to dev? Do I have performance issues? What's a slow start? What's a slow restart? What's a slow action? And then bring that data back into the dev process. Do I have resource utilization issues in my application? So for example, am I taking too much battery? Am I eating too much bandwidth per application minute? And bringing that data back, plus the deep insight from the application, the diagnostics of the application, bringing that back into the dev practice so we can systematically improve that. Another good example in that is you can trace user flow when applications are properly instrumented or wrapped. You can actually trace the user flow. And what we actually find when we're working with applications is how often have you had this experience yourself? You go and you think, okay, I want to take a task. This looks like the right place, followed by the right place, followed by, oh, that didn't work. Back, 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 back. And pretty soon you can keep that, and you can aggregate that over thousands of users over time. And you can actually identify where people are being taken into black holes or dead ends and then recover it. And so all of this is about how do you collect data in operational environments and left shift that back into the development and test environments and use that intelligently. And that becomes the other kind of key, one of the other areas of key innovation that's driving how people are thinking about it. And so that's where we look at the monitoring. It's end-to-end monitoring all the way from the web or the mobile application and every tier of the application environment. Looking at the performance snapshots and being able to do comparatives, plus all of these use cases we described earlier about how do you use production data in dev. But it's also about being able to do the benchmarking. So when we talked about left shift testing or left shift operational monitoring, it's about like taking performance and security testing and monitoring. Synthetic testing, monitoring, they're very similar. You left shift that, and you can do performance benchmarks, and you can see degradation over release editions or versions. And all of that continues to drive an improvement process or a continuous improvement practice back into the development process as well. And then finally, being able to bring that into the analytics. And we talked a lot about how do I analyze the data and drive the user experience and continuously drive that for improvement over time. And that's an example of this next wave of where we're seeing improvement in this whole idea of DevOps practices and DevOps to the cloud. And a good example is like National Australia Bank with David Boyle, their CIO. So one of the key challenges that they were doing is that they wanted to make sure that they had amazing user experience. Again, banking institutions, it's completely being disrupted by online banking or electronic banking. How do you ensure that you have that 5-star application experience, but also how do you constantly bring the newest versions of the software to production? And more, all of these things, they hang together. They're reinforcing sets of concepts about how do you do the development, the testing, the deployment, the release, and then the operational monitoring and bring that entire cycle together. And just tremendous success at National Australia Bank in terms of reducing the amount of time it took to identify problems and to get the problems resolved by taking the data set and making the development and the sustaining engineering teams more productive. Okay, so one last comment a little bit is around some of the work that, at least in my own organization, we've been focused on. And it's our own transformational journey. And one of the things I can say is we ourselves are still learning. You know, the whole idea of DevOps in the cloud, the idea of Agile, the continuous delivery to DevOps with operational monitoring, it's a journey and it's not fully defined yet. You know, it's an evolving discussion, it's an evolving discipline. We've shared some of the things we've learned or what we've found in the market as we've gone along, but I'll talk to you a little bit about the experience that I've been having with some of our own engineering teams. So one of the challenges, if you have an engineering organization, is developers are expensive. You guys might have noticed that these days, and if you're trying to hire in the Bay Area, it's ridiculously expensive. It takes time, you know, as they learn their own craft to become productive. Not in the deck. There was Nicole Fagan and Gene Kim, Nicole Forskin and Gene Kim, they did a study. They actually found that DevOps has a significant improvement on attraction and retention of engineering teams. Should have put that in here. But it was like it's measurable. It's like a 30 or 40% effect that it's easier to attract, lowers the cost, and helps increase retention. It's an interesting concept. But you know, they're expensive. They take a long time to become productive. And they tend to, at least in the Bay Area, circulate a lot. And so one of the things that we wanted to do is how do we become more, you know, how do you improve their productivity and how do you retain them? Well, one of the challenges with developer productivity is, you know, developers will sit there in the morning, they have their coffee, they go through their stand-ups and the scrums, they sit down, they start working on the code, and eventually they've made some progress and they go to do a test check. They check in or they want to do a test binary validation process. And the thing that's important when you're running a dev team is that developer productivity is keeping them there in developing code. And so when they start doing validation, you want to keep that as short as possible. And what people normally like to do is they'll start the process, they'll go get a lunch. That kind of defines, there's a social definition or a psychological definition that means you want to do things within an hour. So what we found, though, is our build validation cycles, at the point in time when we started these releases, build validation cycles were taking 40 minutes. We were running daily builds. We could only catch code change defects after every developer checked in during the course of the daily build. Test environment time. So build validation cycles were taking 2 hours. Test environment times were taking 20 minutes. So 2 hours and 20 minutes. What happens when a developer does a test check-in and sits there now for 2 hours and 20 minutes waiting for the result to validate the work he just did? He's not at lunch. It's a long lunch. He's taking the afternoon off. You know, it's crazy. And so one of the things that we started to do is we started this journey towards Agile with continuous delivery all the way into how do we pull the operational data together. And we were able to reduce through continuous integration and automating the entire build process and a lot of the technical validation, like automating test automation. We reduced that from 2 hours down to 40 minutes. We reduced the environment setup times from 20 minutes down to 5 minutes. So now we're able to compress that to a 45-minute validation process, which allows them to go to lunch and come back and get back to work. It's just a really interesting, small changes like that at the very foundation of the way you do software development and DevOps for the cloud made a huge difference. So we're now driving releases on a monthly basis. And we've adopted a lot of the other practices around feature releases. They're confirmed at mid-sprint. They go into a sandbox. A lot of the modern methodologies that are associated with the software. But it's what it takes for us to be efficient. It's what's taking for us to be competitive in the markets today. It's what's taking for us to be efficient with our developer talent and resources. And it's just a really interesting challenge. It also drove us to evolve one other very interesting innovation. And that is, how do you look at test coverage for validating quality? And a lot of times we look at code coverage. What we started doing is looking at requirements coverage. And so if you think about your business analyst developing the requirements for a particular software project, you can model a requirement as a workflow through the application. So think about, let's take the banking application example. I want to look at my statement. I log in, I go to my accounts page, I select an account, I hit a statement, I enter data around the date range, I generate the statement, I get back a PDF, for example. I might also want to be able to transfer funds. So again, I log in, I go to the account stage, I say transfer funds, I select the to and the from accounts, enter the amount of money I want to move, hit commit, go through all the validation process. And you can design these requirements. I want to view my statement. You can design the requirements. I want to be able to transfer funds. And you can look at these flows. But you notice they start to have common components to it. For example, the login process. And so what we started to do is by designing these flows, you could then kind of stub out your test automation to any specific model in the flow, so like the login process. And then auto-generate all of the test cases based on the flows and the combination of flows. And this is something we started doing around requirements-driven design and requirements-driven test automation. And then let's see, for example, the login changes. Logins today are usually, for example, you have your username and your password, and you can supply test data, you can drive that login process. But what happens if that particular case, someone changes it and it's two-factor authentication? Think about maintaining all those test libraries that have been developed over the years. You just go in, you update the model, you regen your test library. So that's the concept behind that last test volume and coverage kind of improvement. But everything we were doing is kind of this journey, this learning experience as we were moving from and adopting, from a waterfall-based methodology in our software dev teams to Agile, continuous delivery, DevOps, and how do we increase the velocity? And specifically, as we said earlier, we found that the testing ourselves, not just the industry research, but our own experience, the testing was a problem. And that's just really kind of an example I thought I'd share with you about where we were achieving an improvement. Now, a lot of times when I have a chance to talk with people across the industry, people are like, well, how do you get started? And this is really a discussion that we have with any number of companies across the industry. There's a big gap between the concepts and the real world practice. And there's a need for some prescription or some ideas on how to get started. So I can just share what we found. Number one, understanding that all of the investments that we make, the effort we expend in DevOps and DevOps in the cloud is really in support of some business objective. And one of the most important ones is we've pivoted to digital transformation and the app economy. The app is what matters. The number two is the velocity is a function of maintaining competitive pace to the market, not a technical goal of fast release cycles. And so you have to wrap back to these business goals. The second thing is because it's a pivot to horizontal collaboration versus vertical silos, it's a culture change, and that requires the executive sponsorship. Someone's got to be willing to try it. You have to select your teams, and this is kind of, people have to have a different thinking. We talked earlier about it's that spark that exists in the first project team that implements it, and choosing an immediate deliverable, which means start one place, land it successfully, and then expand. I know that these things are these are like motherhood and apple pie, but as a prescription, it works. It lands the concepts and nucleates it, and then it can expand and grow within an organization. Metric programs. The most important thing is being able to substantiate the metrics and being able to prove the business value as well as the technical operating value of adopting these new paradigms. Integrating with existing processes, we still end up having to meet certain ROI capabilities in the organization. Automation, becomes one of the first, and it's like automation of this concept of a code pipeline. Everything hangs off the automation or the orchestrated software lifecycle process, and then celebrating the successes. Too often we rush to the next rev or the next implementation and don't celebrate the success. So this is really kind of looking at this idea of, DevOps in the age of this idea of cloud craftsmanship. We talked a lot about everything is moving to the cloud. There's a big gap between people who say they're DevOps and the ones that actually have the organizational structures to support it. The fact that it's a transformational journey from Agile to continuous delivery to end-to-end DevOps. We talked a little bit about where are the friction points. There's these benefits to this, and then where are the friction points and why aren't more people doing it? And then this is a bit of a prescription as to how to make progress. And so with that, I'd like to thank everyone for their time today. And in the CA booth, I know it's a little bit of a commercial plug, but we have a book that's available if you want to come pick it up. It's DevOps for Digital Thought Leaders, and it spends a lot of time looking at real-world case studies and how all of your colleagues across the industry adopted metric models in order to be successful as they did these transformational journeys. And it's in the booth. It's free to all of you if you want to come by and pick up a copy. Thank you.
Oh, that's great.